In recent weeks, there have been increasingly alarming opinions in the global information space that a war is brewing in the Western Hemisphere, more specifically in Venezuela. If previously this information was presented as assumptions, indirect data, and some insider leaks, starting from October of this year, this opinion has already been voiced at the level of experts and analysts. The seriousness of these concerns is heightened by the extremely unpredictable decisions of Donald Trump, especially in the field of foreign policy. The current occupant of the White House has repeatedly demonstrated a sharp change in rhetoric and practical actions. Almost a complete 180-degree turn, and in a very short period of time. Just look at the whole saga with the sweeping increase in tariffs for almost every country on planet Earth, which came just a few weeks later. Or take, for example, the attitude toward the current Russian-Ukrainian war, when promises to deliver Patriots and Tomahawks to Ukraine were quickly replaced by the need to make a big global deal with Putin. Which, however, never happened. Which is exactly what we talked about in one of our previous videos regarding the possibilities of Yalta. The summit in Anchorage is proof of that. All talk but little action. But today we'll talk about Venezuela and analyze the nature of its hostility toward the United States. We'll talk about the peculiarities of building socialism in this Latin American country and its disastrous results. We'll learn about the peculiarities of the dictatorship of Hugo Chávez and Nicolás Maduro. And of course, we'll also discuss the current escalation of American-Venezuelan relations and the possibility of this conflict turning into a full-scale war. My name is Simon. This is the Megashot television channel. Only verified facts and objective analysis. Let's begin. Venezuela in the 20th century. Venezuela. I'll begin, as usual, with a brief overview of Venezuela's recent history. Up until the end of the 20th century, Venezuela was a typical bandit republic, of which there were plenty in Latin America. Frequent military coups, weak democratic traditions and institutions, and a constant longing for a strong hand from the general junta. Doesn't that remind you of anything? If not, look at our post-Soviet neighbors and it will be clear. However, it's important to make a small but crucial clarification. Venezuela was not a banana republic, but a true oil republic, something like an analog of the famous Arab oil monarchies of the Persian Gulf. Moreover, in terms of proven oil reserves, Venezuela surpasses many Arab sheikdoms and is second only to Saudi Arabia. That's what you could call a South American Klondike, a real El Dorado, only made of black gold. Naturally, such colossal oil fields have always attracted the attention of many global oil producers and oil traders to Venezuela. And first and foremost, of course, from the United States. Almost all Venezuelan oil and its refined products ended up specifically on the American market. The intermediaries in this process were local oligarchic clans, which, in fact, were the main social support for all these military juntas and dictators. Sadly, most of Venezuela's population lived and still lives below the poverty line. Such a situation of deep social contrasts was generally characteristic of many Latin American countries. Just remember Cuba before Fidel Castro came to power. There is a separate video about this on our channel. I highly recommend watching it. Once again, there's a hint of socialism. In the 1990s, Venezuela was hit by a severe economic crisis, primarily caused by a sharp drop in global prices for oil and petroleum products. Such a situation inevitably led to the deepening of already profound contradictions between the rich and the poor in Venezuelan society. And it was quite logical that the popularity of those who embraced leftist socialist ideas began to grow. And one of them was the former Army Lieutenant Colonel Hugo. It was very interesting, and it is very interesting, and it is very interesting. And it was very interesting, and it was interesting, and it was very interesting. This is very interesting and interesting. And it was very interesting, very interesting. This is very interesting, very interesting. And it was very interesting, and it was very interesting, and it was very interesting. All dictators in the post-Soviet space, Putin, Lukashenko, and the rest of the gang, will definitely not let you lie. But Chávez was fundamentally different from traditional Latin American military dictators. First of all, he destroyed long-standing partnership relations with the United States. Almost all oil companies owned by American entrepreneurs were forcibly nationalized. Venezuela's state company Petróleos de Venezuela, Sociedad Anónima, controlled all energy extraction, and oil sales shifted from the United States to its main rival, China. Among other things, Chávez nationalized the electric power industry, metallurgy, and the agro-industrial complex, where American businesses had traditionally held strong positions. All this expropriation of the expropriators came with blatant anti-American propaganda, accusing Uncle Sam of every imaginable and unimaginable sin. And as a result, Venezuela, along with Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, rather quickly became one of Washington's main enemies. Strict economic sanctions were imposed against Venezuela, including an embargo on the export of oil and petroleum products. In response, Chávez quickly and demonstratively was seen with all the anti-American and anti-Western figures he could find on the planet. With Muammar Gaddafi, Bashar Assad, Saddam Hussein, Fidel Castro, Robert Mugabe, Ayatollah Khamenei. And of course with Putin and Lukashenko. How could he do without them? However, the new socialist authorities of Venezuela still kept many of their campaign promises, and they directed part of the income received from oil sales not only to their own enrichment, but also to the implementation of various social projects. Illiteracy in rural areas was nearly wiped out. Over 15,000 medical facilities were built, stable payments to the poor were provided, and major free housing construction began. And overall, according to official data, the poverty rate dropped from 48% to 27%, which was one of the best indicators in all of Latin America. However, all these reforms had a number of drawbacks. The transfer of entire sectors of the economy into state ownership inevitably led to excessive bureaucracy, since all these enterprises had to be managed somehow. Accordingly, during Chávez's years in power, the number of officials increased 3.5 times, which inevitably increased corruption and at all levels. Therefore, much of the allocated budget was simply embezzled. In addition, officials constantly pressured local businesses, suppressing private initiative and increasing their own extortion. But still, the socialist authorities did not dare to completely ban private enterprises, like in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and preferred to increase the tax burden on businessmen. I will also add that the money received from the export of energy resources was invested in consumer goods and social programs, not in the modernization of the economy. This approach, although extremely popular among the population, simply slowed down the development of non-resource and high-tech industries in the long run. For example, the same machine building and instrument-making industries. Therefore, over the years, Venezuela's economy became increasingly primitive and inefficient. As a result, by the end of Chávez's rule, the country was importing almost all goods except oil, even food products. The worst version of the Soviet system. As you already understand, Chávez's power was maintained primarily due to high oil prices, which allowed him to remain highly popular among the poorest segments of the population. And in addition, his personal charisma combined with anti-American propaganda. But he died on March 5, 2013. Interestingly, the Venezuelan dictator's death occurred on the 60th anniversary of Stalin Djugashvili's death, which is symbolic. It's a very remarkable coincidence. Unlike Stalin, Chávez managed to name his successor. That was Nicolas Maduro, an unremarkable grey bureaucrat with no oratory talent or managerial skills. In Soviet times, such people were called party apparatchiks. That's why at the very beginning of his career, he almost lost the election to the opposition candidate, Enrique Capriles. Victory was achieved only through massive use of administrative resources and ballot stuffing. And then, things got even worse. Unlike the 2000s oil boom, global oil prices collapsed in 2014. 2015 falling from about $100 to $40 per barrel. The sharp decline in foreign currency earnings finally crippled the already stagnating Venezuelan economy. But to create the appearance of control over the situation, Maduro turned the printing press on full blast. This caused extreme hyperinflation. In 2015, it hit 180%. By 2016, 270%. In 2017, 860%. In 2018, inflation exceeded 130,000%. Yes, you heard that right. 130,000%, not just 130. It's surreal, to say the least. It's no wonder that the Venezuelan bolivar was recognized as the most devalued currency in the world. The authorities also tried to introduce a fixed exchange rate for the national currency and government price controls. However, the result was just the disappearance of goods from store shelves and a rapid rise of the black market, where you could get almost anything, but at huge prices. To combat this shortage, the club ration card system was introduced, but its effectiveness turned out to be low due to corruption among local officials. In addition, Maduro used this social program for political purposes, primarily distributing free food packages only to his supporters. This only further divided Venezuelan society. The crime situation rapidly worsened, street crime flourished, and the country began to experience a mass exodus of its population. Amid this, the opposition grew very active. Protests often broke out in Venezuela, escalating into mass riots and sometimes involving weapons. The authorities responded with widespread force. In 2015, for the first time in many years, the opposition won the parliamentary elections. His long confrontation with Maduro began, which led to the dictator announcing elections for a new body, the Constituent Assembly, which effectively took over legislative functions, stripping them from the members of parliament. The parliament did not recognize this, nor did it recognize the results of the 2018 presidential elections in which Maduro won again. The Speaker of Parliament, Juan Guaidó, declared that Maduro had lost legitimacy and announced himself as the acting president. The United States, European Union, many Western countries, and Ukraine quickly recognized him as Venezuela's leader. It was logical that Russia, China, and many other authoritarian leaders supported the current dictator. As a result, Venezuela ended up with a de facto dual power situation and an acute political crisis, which overlapped with the economic crisis and led to new mass riots and bloody clashes, and even to a new attempt at a military coup. But Maduro managed to hold on to power again. The key factor was that he was supported by the security forces. Most army officers remained loyal to the leader, since potentially disloyal personnel had been purged back in Chávez's time. But Maduro still failed to completely suppress the opposition. That's why Venezuela still continues to live under political and economic crisis and an unprecedented wave of crime. The unemployment rate reaches 30% of the adult population. That's why in just the last 5 years, more than 3 million people have left the country. In addition, according to the latest data, Venezuela ranks 178th out of 180 in the Corruption Perceptions Index. Every year, Venezuela's gross domestic product decreases by an average of 15%. Being one of the world's largest oil producers, the country nevertheless faces a severe shortage of basic necessities: food, medicine, and attention, even gasoline. In a word, government policies are sliding into the abyss of poverty, hopelessness, and real armed conflict. This is what ill-conceived socialist experiments have led to. The Latin American version of the Soviet system has long outperformed the original. But regular people don't feel better because of it. The Stars and Stripes fleet. And now let's return to the present day. Everything would be fine, but Venezuela has been on the brink of civil war for years, so everything seemed to be as usual. But in August 2015, the possibility of another war appeared, an external one, with the sworn enemy of the late Chávez and the still living Maduro. After all, the American fleet appeared on the horizon. About a dozen United States military ships suddenly left their permanent stations, particularly the naval base in Puerto Rico, and moved toward the shores of Venezuela. At the same time, they did not directly enter its territorial waters, but stayed at a distance of approximately 70 to 100 kilometers from the coast. Among this flotilla, there are at least 3 destroyers equipped with the well-known Tomahawk missiles, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and the nuclear submarine Newport News. Estimates suggest personnel may number between 4,000 and 10,000. Such a concentration of American naval forces in the Caribbean Sea is unprecedented in the last 30 years. Officially, the United States authorities explain that this is how they are fighting the rampant drug cartels. They claim that Maduro is working together with Colombian and Peruvian cocaine barons and allows them to transport their goods through Venezuelan territory and then by sea to the United States. The American squadron is needed only to combat drug trafficking. That's quite a peaceful and noble goal. However, many experts, as well as ordinary people, do not believe this version, considering it nothing more than a cover for a planned military intervention in Venezuela. They claim that the fight against drug cartels is nothing more than a pretext for invasion, and the real goal is to overthrow Maduro's regime. Since 2019, the United States has not recognized his legitimacy, demanding his voluntary resignation and a transfer of power to the pro-democracy parliamentary opposition. The United States is offering a monetary reward for information leading to Maduro's arrest or conviction under the NRP program to fight international drug trafficking. In 2020, this reward was $15 million. Biden increased it to 25, and Trump doubled this amount just a few months ago. Such a large reward was not even offered for the head of terrorist number one, Osama bin Laden, taking advantage. The text notes the United States previously intervened in Latin America, similar to the current invasion. Rapid, precise special operations completed quickly with minimal losses. The most telling example is the invasion of Panama in 1989. At that time, President George Bush Sr. accused the local dictator, Manuel Noriega, of protecting drug trafficking and having ties with the legendary cocaine king, Pablo Escobar. At that time, before the intervention, they were being introduced. Visa restrictions and other types of economic pressure. A few months before the operation, the United States held frequent military exercises near Panama, similar to the current situation in the Caribbean. And on top of all that, you can add Donald Trump's own imperialist rhetoric, which makes many people, if not afraid, then at least stop and think. Just remember his constant statements about the 51st state of the United States, a role he sometimes assigns to Canada and sometimes to Greenland. So, taking all these factors into account, the whole situation around Venezuela looks quite serious. He is a potential president. There is another factor that can also be interpreted as an indirect sign that the United States is preparing a change of political regime in Venezuela. Even if not by military means, then by a combined approach, or as we would say in Ukraine, by a hybrid approach. We are talking about the recent and rather unexpected awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to the Venezuelan opposition figure Maria Corina Machado, which surprised the entire international community. Although, as is known, Donald Trump was really counting on this award, the Nobel Committee decided otherwise. And now many journalists, experts, and politicians are looking for a certain hidden meaning in this choice. After all, in her homeland, Maria Machado is one of the most uncompromising opponents of Maduro's dictatorship. But outside of Venezuela, very little is known about her. Although she began her political career at a young age, almost immediately after Hugo Chávez came to power. That's not surprising, since her family was directly impacted by the socialist president's actions, the metallurgical business, which was closely tied to the United States economy. After joining the National Assembly, Machado consistently criticized Chávez and Maduro and called for their resignation. It appears she has now received the Nobel Prize. Machado surprisingly dedicated her win directly to Trump, not anyone else. In turn, the American president also spoke very complimentarily about her. Secretary of State Marco Rubio backed the decision, calling Machado a courageous defender of democracy. Thus, there is a well-founded opinion that the United States authorities have already decided on the candidacy of the new president of Venezuela. All that's left is the small matter of bringing her to power. Naturally, the reaction of the Venezuelan dictator was quite predictable. Maduro called Machado a demonic witch, and the very awarding of the Peace Prize to her immoral, as it encourages violence and wars instead of peace. Maduro directly accused Machado of calling on the United States to invade Venezuela in order to overthrow the government, which was, in fact, a blatant lie. In general, lately Maduro has intensified his anti-American rhetoric, conducted counter-military exercises, emphasizing that the country is literally packed with Russian weapons. This is partly true since for many years Venezuela was one of the largest clients of the Russian military-industrial complex. However, if Maduro is hoping for direct intervention from his Kremlin friend, he is in for a huge disappointment no matter what. He is busy with other things right now, and he definitely won't be distracted by any wars other than the one with Ukraine. Bashar Assad can definitely confirm that. So, will there be an invasion after all? Since at the moment, neither Russia nor China has any real way to help their protege. Thus, all subsequent events rely solely on Donald Trump and his inner circle's decisions, as well as on the availability of the necessary resources for a full-scale military intervention and a realistic assessment of all potential risks and associated costs. In short, the United States will only invade if they're certain the war will be brief with minimal losses, especially among the personnel, a sort of American-style blitzkrieg. But this could pose major problems. On one hand, in theory, an American invasion could really be supported by numerous opponents of Maduro's regime and ultimately lead to its overthrow. 4 years ago, Putin and his security team planned the special military operation, expecting mass pro-Russian demonstrations in Ukraine. We already know how these rosy dreams ended. On the other hand, the very fact of an American invasion could actually consolidate Venezuelan society and thereby strengthen Maduro's power. This is known as rallying around the flag or leader, the besieged fortress principle. In that case, even with clear technological and organizational advantages, United States troops might face what they already dealt with 2 decades ago in Afghanistan and Iraq. A rapid defeat of the enemy's regular forces, taking control of major cities, destroying political forces, but then a prolonged and exhausting guerrilla struggle with an enraged local population. And the territory of Venezuela is perfectly suited for underground warfare, with a significant part of it covered by impassable tropical forests and swamps. Just like in Vietnam, only on a much larger scale and with even greater losses for the Americans themselves. Therefore, if we realistically assess the likelihood of an invasion today, the probability is moderate, not zero, but still far from critical. Moreover, the forces concentrated off the coast of Venezuela are clearly insufficient for a full-scale intervention, except perhaps for launching missile strikes against certain specific targets. But you and I both know missiles, bombs and drones alone can't overthrow a hostile government. No matter how many strikes Russia carries out deep into Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainians aren't even thinking about surrendering. No matter how many times Israel hit Iran this summer, the Ayatollah regime didn't even waver. In such matters, only the soldier's boot is decisive, no matter how strange that may sound in our time. Apparently, at this point, Trump is betting on the informational and psychological effect. He is using military ships as another tool to pressure Maduro, while covering it up as a fight against drug cartels. It is quite possible that the calculation is precisely that this factor, combined with the deep economic crisis and various hybrid operations, will lead to a full-scale armed uprising of Venezuelans against their dictator. Then, at the final stage, the United States might directly intervene in order to guarantee its interests and restore its lost influence over Venezuela in the event of a possible change of power, and in no way allow the emergence of new Chávezes and Maduros. As for Ukraine's interests in this potential conflict, everything is extremely simple here. Right now, it's very disadvantageous for us if the United States gets distracted by other conflicts, especially if they become involved in a new prolonged war. Just remember how, because of the outbreak of war in the Middle East, Biden was forced to redirect a significant portion of funds and weapons to support Israel. The same thing will happen with Venezuela, although many Ukrainians might be pleased that Putin will have one less ally. However, in politics, sober calculation should always come first, not emotion, even if those emotions are completely justified. Thank you to all the channel sponsors for your support during this difficult time, and to viewers for watching the videos, liking and commenting. See you next episode. Goodbye, everyone.